It would help if I turn this on. I'll call the meeting to order. This is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Community Corrections Partnership. Take roll call. I'll start on my right if you'll state your name and the agency you represent.
Eddie Rodriguez, Chief of Police, City of Marina, representing the Monterey County Chiefs.
Mandy Gonzalez, Assistant CEO.
Mike Moore, Undersheriff, representing Sheriff Steve Bernal.
Marcia Parsons, Probation.
Cynthia Hassan, Deputy County Counsel.
Elliot Robinson, Department of Social Services.
Berkeley Brannon, Chief Assistant DA, representing Dean Flippo, District Attorney.
Frank Dice, Interim Public Defender.
Amy Miller, Behavioral Health.
Thank you. I do have a correction to the agenda. I would like to switch item B and C so that the first scheduled matter is to receive the quarterly statistical report. The second scheduled matter is to receive a presentation on AB 109 funded services. The third presentation is the strategies and methodologies for the budget workshop. And the last item is the fiscal report. Are there any other corrections or additions to the agenda?
No, there are no other additions or corrections to the agenda.
Thank you. I'll now take public comment on any item that is not on the agenda. Seeing no public comment, we'll go on to the approval of the minutes. We have the minutes from the regular meeting of May 9th, 2016. Is there any changes or corrections to the minutes? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Manny Gonzalez, second by Elliot Robinson. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Abstain? Thank you. Okay, we have 4 presentations today. The first one is going to be on the quarterly statistical data report, and I'll ask Management Analyst 3, Robin Rodriguez, to do that presentation.
Good afternoon. Today's review is actually not really a presentation. We're just distributed the quarterly report, and I would comment that there's really no significant statistical shifts between this quarter and last quarter. I think the most notable thing was the increased caseload size for PRCS on the front. We're showing a slight increase here. As of today, though, our current caseload status for PRCS is 333, so I wouldn't say that number is continuing to go up.
What was it again? I'm sorry.
For the PRCS cases.
And what is it today?
It's 330 today. So I would say that's probably not trending up significantly yet. Most of our numbers fluctuate from quarter to quarter. The demographic data remains almost completely the same with minor shifts. The jail population, as of June of 2016, we had 894 people in the jail. At that time, 36% of those people that were in the jail were part of the 1170H sentenced population. And our alternative to custody statistics stay relatively the same. I didn't see any major statistical shifts in this quarter. Were there any questions?
Any questions from the board for Robin? Any discussion?
Just real quick on the at the bottom of page 3, what we mean when we say that the number of 1170 inmates in custody, those are sentenced inmates.
Yes, they are.
And I would just suggest that we actually state that. But
okay.
So it would read number of sentenced 1170Hs.
Yes, and I will make that correction for next time, and I'll also confirm that with jail staff. Generally, I work with Don Weber on those statistics, so I can confirm that with him.
Is there any public comment on item number 1, or item A, I'm sorry?
Hi, thank you. I'm Susie Brusa. I'm the CEO at Rancho Cielo. And I just thought it might be appropriate to illuminate a little bit about what our services are, because the small matrix that we present I don't think is very explanatory, and I can work with the management staff to see if there isn't a better way to portray it. But I think it's important to understand that the important resources that you allocate to us through the AB 109 realignment paid in the last fiscal year more than 8,000 hours in wages to these young men. And, they're actually our employees. And you reimburse us for those wages for AB 109 participants. You also reimburse us for a portion of case management that we provide to the young people. What you don't reimburse us for, and I'm not asking for reimbursement, shocking, but wanted to point out that one of the benefits of being a Rancho Cielo participant is we also have available housing and available schooling. And so we have one who got a diploma, and we have 2 who are living with us for a total of 592 nights of safe sleep out of the neighborhood. And those that have successfully completed are placed in unsubsidized employment. And those folks are working at the Don Chapin Company, at Pacific Grove Millworks, at Lawson Restoration, at the Monterey Plaza Hotel and Spa, and other distinguished employers. So I just wanted to make sure, because it looks like our numbers are small on a per capita basis, but our services are deep. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Is there any further board discussion on item number A? Seeing none, we'll go on to item number B, which is formerly C. I'll ask Robin to come up again, and this is a presentation, right? It is. Thank you. Hang on a minute. Can we access this by turning on our computers?
Oh, wow, you're good.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of background before we start this. During this last February, the CCP approved the budget that was recommended to the Board of Supervisors for the current fiscal year. At that time, there was some discussion about the need to prepare. Oh, do I need it? Okay, is that better? At that time, there was some discussion about the need to prepare for future funding decisions and to create a roadmap reflecting the budget process. Specifically, the voting members requested that the roadmap being provided allow for a comparison to other counties, set options and targets for funding, evaluate and prioritize how programs are funded, and research an appropriate reserve balance amount. In preparation for these funding decisions that will be made during the budget workshop, this is a brief presentation to introduce you to what is currently being funded through AB 109. The framework is built around 3 questions that are commonly asked at these meetings. What does this position or program do? Why is that important? And what are we getting? Although this is not a presentation on the budget, and we're not showing you costs associated with any of the services at this time, all of the items shown here are directly in line with the budget. A more in-depth description of each program or service will be provided at the next CCP meeting in November, where we will begin to look at the actual costs budgeted and proposed outcome measures for future program evaluation. So for today, We'll spend about 15 minutes looking at the funding received by the District Attorney's Office and the Sheriff's Office, and in November, we'll be covering probation and behavioral health. So to put this all into context, the assembly bills that we reference are 109 and 117, and as I think everyone here knows, they made significant changes to the sentencing and supervision of people convicted of felony offenses. These changes resulted in the county having new mandated responsibilities for custody and supervision. As a result, the county receives an allocation from the state to support these new responsibilities. The goals of the community corrections programs that are funded through this money are to enhance public safety, provide a range of supervision tools, sanctions, and services, maximize offender restitution, hold offenders accountable, and improve public safety outcomes. So we're going to review each partner's funded services and answer the three basic questions I mentioned. What does the program or position do? Why is this important? And what do we get? And starting with the District Attorney's Office, we're looking at a victim advocacy position. And this position helps victims with restitution, support collections and appeals, develops and implements a plan to collect restitution from 1170H inmates and to ensure compliance with Marsy's law, searches for victim identification, contact information, and determines the amount of financial loss, and tracks the amount of restitution ordered to victims. This is important because restitution collection processes and policies established by CDCR do not apply to offenders sentenced pursuant to 1170H. And victims of PRCS and 1170H offenders are entitled to and deserve representation and assistance with notification, restitution, collection, and the status of their case. So for this, we get one victim advocate, a full-time employee, supportive services from the program manager at no additional cost, and an increase in the amount of restitution collected for victims. For the Sheriff's Office, in the category of classification, we have a position that provides classification and housing reviews for inmates. This person assists the county in complying with legal obligations for inmate safety, care, and welfare under Title 15. This is important because it ensures proper programming and housing of inmates. It increases inmate supervision, care, and welfare. It increases safety and security of inmates, staff, and visitors, and it avoids costly Title 15 non-compliance repercussions. And what we get for this is one FTE deputy sheriff in the classifications unit. For the category of medical escort and transport, we have positions that provide transportation services for inmates to other correctional facilities. This provides safe and secure escort services for inmates needing medical, mental health, and dental care. And this is important because it allows for an increased ability to effectively and efficiently provide expanded care. This assists the county in complying with the legal obligations for inmate safety, care, and welfare. For this, we get 7 FTE deputy sheriffs to provide medical escort and medical transportation services. 1 FTE deputy sheriff provides transportation to and from other county jails, community programs, or fire camps for placement of inmates to reduce overcrowding. For the category of additional jail beds, this funding provides an allocation for out-of-county housing and care for inmates. And this is important because it allows the county to meet the legal obligations for inmate care and welfare. It increases safety and security for all inmates, staff, and visitors. And it allows for additional inmate education program space. We get funds that are allocated to house up to 45 inmates per year outside of Monterey County. In the category of parole beds, This funding provides for the incarceration of state parolees who now serve their sentences locally. As a result of realignment, all parole revocations are now served in the county jail rather than in state prison, and the cost of housing these parole violators was shifted to the county jail. So our budget allows for reimbursement that's allocated for the cost of housing for up to 23 parolees per day for 12 months. In the category of treatment services, this funding allows for the expansion of an existing in-custody treatment program to reach a larger population for services in the areas of drug and alcohol education and recovery, anger management, and other subject matters. This is important because evidence-based substance abuse treatment services are available to incarcerated offenders. Research shows that it can reduce drug use and related criminal behavior, and offenders who participate in reentry services while incarcerated have an increased chance of success. What we get is multiple programs accessible to all eligible inmates, providing education in the areas of anger management, decision-making, parenting and child development, relapse prevention, self-esteem, and interpersonal skills. And in the category of program development, program management, and criminal intelligence analysis, these positions provide research, development, and implementation of evidence-based programs for offenders, provides ombudsman services for all inmates and their families and the community, coordinates a new process to manage change, and provides county-wide criminal intelligence information and analysis. This is important because it expands programs and services to inmates and improves reintegration and rehabilitation services. It ensures transparency and effectiveness and efficiency in the inmate grievance process, and it provides greater opportunity to understand criminal conduct, recidivism, and serve the inmate community. For this, we have one FTE management analyst, a corrections program manager, one FTE management analyst, a corrections ombudsman, and one FTE criminal intelligence specialist. In the category of catastrophic medical, this funding pays for medical claims that go above the cap imposed by the county's current in-custody medical care contract. And this is important because it enables the county to pay for inmate medical expenses through a planned dedicated fund. For this, we get payment of actual medical costs over the $15,000 threshold of the current medical contract for inmate medical expenses. For the category of the intake nurse, this position provides medical screening for every individual booked into custody. And this is important because it allows for additional medical and mental health staffing to respond to increases and changes to medical and mental health requirements as a result of realignment. It ensures immediate medical, mental health, or dental needs are identified and addressed. And for this, we get 24/7 medical screening by a qualified medical personnel for all arriving individuals in custody. So this concludes part one. Part two will be completed at our next meeting, and I think I mentioned we'll be covering behavioral health and probation. Does anyone have any questions on this?
Any questions or comments from the board?
I wonder if it would be helpful to, especially as we move forward and maybe even relating to these various positions, just to have a line item budget cost for each of them?
Yes. So this is a brief introduction to just simply what's in the budget. After we complete this, in our November meeting, you're going to get sheets on every line item with every associated cost and some identified outcome measures associated with each one. So definitely more specific data will be available.
Thank you.
Is there any public comment on this item? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll move on to item number C, formally item number B. And I'll ask Management Analyst Marissa Fiore to come forward. Thanks, Marissa.
Sure. Does it work? Yes. Board member and chair, my name is Marisa Fiore. I'm a management analyst for probation. And what you have in front of you is a document, a little memo, that illustrates some of the information that we have collected from other departments and other jurisdictions in preparation of your budget workshop. And we did that through a short survey that we circulated through the Chief Probation Officers Association. We contacted other jurisdictions, we reviewed documents, and we analyzed some of the information that we received. And we found out some elements in common and different, and the document is structured with findings and recommendations. These are recommendations for further thinking and discussion. They're not recommendations for action at this point, because we wanted to start the thinking process and the discussion on these items. So the first one is that when the realignment started in 2011, it was an incredibly fast process and did not find the counties all at the same point in time, level of resources, type of services. And that was recognized by the legislature, which indicated that when each county was developing a plan, that plan should be consistent with the local needs and resources. So some jurisdictions had more resources, some jurisdictions had already alternative to detentions in place, and some jurisdictions had none. So we do recommend that although we will continue to research and collect information from other jurisdictions, they were mindful of the fact that Monterey might have different challenges than Riverside or Sonoma or the country of LA. The other finding, the second one, was that all counties and all CCP seem very mindful of these two mandates, custody and supervision, for the realigned offenders. And so you see that the funding recommendation typically reflect these priorities, which we also recommend that would be in line with the state and with this realignment mandate. And in fact, if we look at funding priorities, which is the third finding, we see that jurisdictions have already either started a process of determining priorities, and Sonoma is a good example. They adopted a tier ranking system so that some services were determined based on certain criteria to be critical or beneficials or ancillary, so that they could prioritize their program and services based on a logical process. And therefore, when faced with reduction or changes, they could apply the process to their thinking. In general, we can see the funding is allocated to manage custody and supervision needs, also including alternative to custody. For example, electronic monitoring is pretty prevalent, pre-trial services, and day reporting centers, which serve both as an alternative to custody and a treatment center. There are reentry services. Sometimes these reentry services are initiated while the offender is in jail. There are a lot of cognitive behavioral interventions and evidence-based practices and programs as facilitated by the law and emphasized by the law. And of course, there are some ancillary support services, typically employment and housing. Again, distributed differently, but this seems to be common themes. So our recommendation is also for the CCP to discuss and possibly identify a tier system or a methodology so that priorities and criteria are given to the programs that it's currently funding or funding in the future. This system is then presented to the Board of Supervisors as a recommendation for their final approval. One of the big issues that counties are facing on finding number 4, which is the reserve balance, is that costs are rising inevitably, and fund balances, which typically counties do have at this point, are declining. And everybody is conscious of the fact that a conservative approach is quite prudent under the circumstances. Some counties, Riverside is an example, has already been facing reductions because they allocated their annual allocation plus all the reserves. So they were in the situation where they had already to determine and select some funding cuts. And some other counties are trying other methodologies. For example, Mendocino is a small county, but they don't allocate the growth fund until after they have received, because the growth funds they're only projected. So they're kind of a year behind for growth funds. Others, Humboldt is an example, have determined to use unspent rollover funding only for contracted services, so no county positions or one-time purchases. And there's been a discussion in many, many counties to keep a certain amount of reserve balance, anything between 5 and 15%. And YOLO, interestingly, has approved a reserve policy, a simple policy that determines a range and what the reserve balance will be used for and what was the purpose, face budget cuts and rising costs. So it behooves our CCP as well to adopt a reserve policy, discuss a reserve policy and adopt it, and then in a fiscally conservative approach, maintain a certain reserve, a certain amount that is being determined as wise and feasible. And the last finding, it's a challenge that all counties have at many levels, just not in criminal justice, but it is the issue of data collection and data sharing, which is a big issue for all of us. The BSCC, which is the state entity, the Board of State and Community Corrections, that assists counties and collects information, reports yearly from all counties data, and I believe the next one is going to be posted within the next month. But there are no consistent measures that are being standardized and required at this juncture. Counties have been producing a lot of output measures, activities, but they're all kind of struggling with the outcome measures. And several of them have retained outside services from evaluators, Sacramento and Fresno and Sonoma, that would help them identify what the outcome measures are and how they should be measured. And so in our county, probation staff has already identified an internal strategic plan to collect data. We know that we will need an infrastructure to store and match data from different entities. And we're also working with the Superior Court to retrieve conviction data from the courts themselves, and then start building on the infrastructure. So our recommendation, obviously, is to continue to collect the outputs and to initiate a process about defining and collecting outcomes, and consider adopting a plan, a strategic plan for AB 109, data collection and data sharing. And that concludes the information that we have received. As I said, the idea is to start the thinking and the conversation in preparation for the budget workshop, where the CCP can make decisions on these items and possibly more. And if there are any questions?
Any questions from members of the board?
I just have a few thoughts. Some of the recommendations, like on principle, of fiscally conservative reserve policy, I'd be wary of just kind of being kind of blanket like that, because I think whatever it is, we need a smart policy, right, which kind of takes into account having sufficient reserves, but also sometimes you do have the flexibility to invest in policies that make a difference. I know that's, kind of in local government, we're really measured by the difference that we make in the community. And that really has to be, for me, that's a top priority to have both the information and the policy that really advances making a difference both for safety of our community and for well-being of the AB 109 population, because they're part of that fabric of community. So when I saw that, I just, I get fiscal conservatism and I have my own moments there, but I don't want a blanket policy, and so that recommendation just kind of caught my eye.
Thank you. Mr. Brannan?
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask a question about the budget sheet, and then it'll dovetail back in, or are we going to do that separately? It'll be next. Let me ask you this then. On this budget workshop, can you just kind of give us an idea of what that's going to look like? I mean, I know you've come up with some recommendations here. Is the purpose of the budget workshop to come up with, obviously, I'm just sort of, I guess, let me phrase it this way. I'm struck by the lack of any recommendation for us to create some methodology, really, for trying to get our budget aligned, because we're spending more than we take in, or at least looks like we're going to. I guess that's the right way to phrase that. Is that something that are we leaving all that for the budget workshop? And how did you pick these particular recommendations ahead of the workshop?
Yes, because we don't want to assume to make choices for the CCP, but we want to bring forth some proposal on how to address some of these challenges. We want to raise the awareness that the funding is finite. There is a way to manage it. There are different ways to manage it. And we hope to embark in a wise process to manage money in consideration of the fact that there might be some services that need to be enhanced or continued, and that's for the CCP. So to answer your questions, we envision at the workshop to have all this information and for the CCP to make the final decisions on how they want to proceed. Some counties, for example, have chosen not to fund new programs. It's a policy decision, and a county might decide to adopt it or not. The fact is that we know that the funding is going to be declining if we go at this rate, and so we want to address it. We have time. I mean, it's not happening tomorrow. That's a good news. More so of a reason to prep for that time so we have soft landing instead of some of the hard landing that we have suffered, for example, in the juvenile arena when we had a 25% cut in April for the end of the fiscal year. So we don't want to be in those type of situations. If we can avoid it, it was very traumatic for our contract providers as well. So we would like to use the next 4 to 5 years strategically. And that would be the purpose of the
Are other counties having to go about cutting their budgets too? Do we know? I mean, are the counties
Riverside
facing the
did.
basic scenario?
Riverside already did. They did a 4% reduction for most of their programs. It's noticeable that most of the programs in Riverside are managed by county entities versus external or CBOs. So that cut was across county agencies. And then one of the agencies that was unable to provide sufficient information was cut more.
Do we know how they went about doing that on their CCP?
In this case, they did a 4% cut across the board. So
each department receiving funds came up with how they wanted to meet that 4%
Correct.
level.
Very similar to the county process. So maybe they were familiar with that, and being a county entity, they were more comfortable with the process. Sonoma instead did something different, because if you assign a tier process or strategy, obviously some programs are going to be deemed more important than others and will be funding for continuation on a more sure basis, because the CCP already created their own criteria. So when they're presented, they just apply the criteria that they themselves chosen. And so the criticals are typically the services that must continue. And what's the other one? The ancillary are the ones that might not get funding if the money is not there, and so forth.
Was each department required to assign a tier to their various budget items? Or?
No, the CCP as a body decided it was more function-related versus department-related, minding that they wanted to keep detentions and alternative to detention and supervision, kind of like the basic services and mandates. But then within that great umbrella, they had their own. They had a lot of documentation on their process, actually. So we can prepare more documentation or summaries of this for your meeting. Okay.
I have a question. Regarding data collection, I guess based on your recommendation of developing a strategic plan or adopting a strategic plan on data collection and reporting, do you consider your data collection process right now reliable, or is this whole process is about making it more reliable? Because obviously, the more reliable the data is, it helps this group here develop priorities over funding, and what are we going to maintain, what are we going to cut? So how reliable is our data collection right now?
Well, I'll defer maybe to my colleague, but one of the challenges is to match the data across different agencies, making sure that you validate that offender is the same offender, which is the same offender, and so forth. So that is part of the element. We have staff assigned to the task. Do you want to comment to that, or because she's more?
Yeah, as Robin's coming up, because that goes to my point. How reliable is that information?
So I think it's actually a complex issue because the data that we collect is reliable. We have systems in place to validate it. I have staff that we run queries. We make sure that the data that we're querying out of our system is what we think it is. The data going in goes through a quality assurance process. So I don't have a lot of concerns about data reliability. I can't totally speak on that in terms of the jail data or the court data. I can only speak to probation data for that. But the reason that it's a more complex conversation is because data, when you look at all of the data, you've got probation's data, and you have the jail data, and you have the court data. We have all of the funded provider data. Most of the provider data is in our efforts to outcomes system that we built and started at the beginning of 2015. The rest of the data is in different systems. So we have a challenge now of figuring out how we merge and house all of that data. It has to be matched. Data that comes from the court that's also in probation system, and then that person's received services from a number of our service providers. We want to ultimately be able to match that data so we can look at recidivism and we can look at correlations and the relationship between people who recidivated and what other things did they have in common, what types of services did they receive. Honestly, I know that the CCP members would like to see direct relationships between recidivism and specific services. I don't think that's going to be realistic. To try to pinpoint one specific service provider or one specific type of service against recidivism is not something that I can quite picture how to do. I think it's very complex. But ideally, if we can get all of our data housed and we can build the infrastructure for that, then we can also be in a better position to use outside evaluators and consultants and give them pieces of that research data and ask them to look at specific questions.
So is the strategic plan going to address those realities so that it's clear to us what we can actually measure against?
What's realistic and what's
Yes.
not, yes. Honestly, I haven't gotten that far down the road because I haven't been in a position to have all of that data in my hands in a housed format where it's all matched and clean and ready to go. So at this point, we've pretty much mastered getting our own data and reporting on that, setting up a system to gather all of the provider data and trying to evaluate right now, is the data that we're collecting the right data? Is it meaningful data? We'd like to be presenting the CCP more information on outcomes and less information on output, really identifying things that we want to measure that are meaningful. but that's also a dialogue that we have to have with each of our service providers and have them help us identify what they feel is meaningful and what are the goals of their program. How do they want to measure that? So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think that part of that work, though, is in building that infrastructure. And when AB 109 hit, we really didn't have an infrastructure in place for all of that. And the county at large doesn't have an infrastructure that houses multiple data sets from different departments. It's all been kind of an individual effort so far.
Thank you.
Manny?
Chair, I had a couple questions. One was along the same lines as Elliot regarding reserves. I think that establishing a prudent reserve is something we should look at. I also wondered what are the other counties are using as a guide to create a reserve? What are they basing it on? If we can come up with something similar, and also some criteria to ask for if programs come up that departments or an entity wants to look at. What are some criteria for maybe pursuing some of those reserves at some point? Are we going to establish a criteria where some certain money, there might be a program that comes up that we might want to look at? How would we evaluate, is there going to be some criteria for entities to apply for, some of that reserve? The other question I had has to do with, I don't know if we have this or if it's something we should look at, but what percentage of the funds are being spent on county staff versus direct services to the population that we're trying to serve? And I don't know if other counties are either track it or are interested in that kind of information, because I think it's something that we should look at. Are some counties saying that, it's a 50-50 split on what monies are going to make available to direct services versus paying for, some county staff is providing direct services, but at the same time, what money is being spent on direct services to inmates out in the community? So I don't know if that's something that can be, is that something that other counties track? So I just throw that out as information to pursue. Thank you.
So as a general concept, because we had a lot of conversation with our colleague counties, in terms of the reserve amounts, they can be a little bit all over the board. YOLO, for example, they determine that their reserve should be 5 to 15%, so there is a big gap between those two, of the annual CCP expenditures over the prior years. And they specifically stated that they wanted to have a reserve for economic downturns, for the growth amount, which can go severely down if we are in a bad economy, or for emergency funding. And in their policy, in terms of the new reserve, the use of the reserve, they determined that they would not fund any new programs or positions unless there was an identified source of funding. That's what they chose to do. I know that a lot of counties look at 10% as a reserve amount for their funding. So the idea is for this CCP to, maybe based on some other information that we can provide or recommendation, to determine if they should have a reserve and if the reserve should have at least a range, 5 to 15, 10%, or whatever. Because at this point, there is no decision made one way or the other. So that would be still a recommendation for the Board of Supervisors, because the second part of the conversation is the counties are very conscious of the fact that it used to be a state responsibility, now it's a county responsibility. At the end of the day, the county is responsible for funding these programs. So the law does not say, nor we haven't found county to, in general, to determine a certain percentage of services to be provided by county or other entities. Obviously, supervision and custody services have to be managed by the entities, sheriff and probation, they are responsible for those. But in terms of services to clients, we find some employment, let's say, managed by county entities, as well as CBOs. And it seems to be something that is decided by each individual county based on how many service providers they have, which internal resources they have, and so forth. And that's why we discussed at the beginning the fact that each county will have its own internal challenges, and the ones that were blessed with bigger infrastructure, for example, the one that already had, some counties already had a lot of alternative to detentions because they had cap jails in place before realignment started, are in the different positions that maybe our county or a smaller county that had to start from scratch. So.
Any other questions, comments from the board? I'll open it up for public comment. Is there any public comment on this item? Seeing none, we'll go on to the last item. It was to be given by my finance manager, Dawn Sosa, but she had a family emergency and had to leave. So Marissa has graciously agreed to do this. Please be gentle on her.
Thank you, Chief. Okay, in front of you, you have a now familiar document prepared by our fiscal manager. Familiar because every quarterly meeting, we provide an update on the same document. So what I like to point out is that up to fiscal year 14-15, the numbers are actuals. In the what's called the current year, the year that we just closed, 15-16, they're still projected because we're going to close the books around beginning of September. So by the next meeting in November, those are going to become actuals. And what that could happen is that the reserve balance goes up, for example, because not all the projected expenses are going to actualize. But until September, we're still in a projected phase. For fiscal year 16 and 17, the allocation of $12,035,574 includes $150,000. This is some funding that the state allocates year by year, so it's not a given, and it only allocates if counties fill out that survey that we always do in December, if you recall. So we did last December. The legislature allocated the funding, and so it's included in the $12 million. While the following years, projected 17, 18, does not have it yet because we don't know if it's going to actually happen. As far as the growth allocation is concerned, that is a projected number, and it does not include about 10% that is being allocated through the local innovation sub-account. This is something new that is going to be happening, and when the funds are received in the fall, this body is going to make a recommendation on how to spend it. And then the third line is the annual funding allocation without the reserve and the reserve so forth. Now, in the years 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20, the growth allocation is very flat at a small amount. This is the initial projection because there is a lot of discussion about the economy actually going into a decline, and if that's the case, the growth fund, which is the funds that are on top of the allocation and are dependent on taxes, might diminish. So those numbers might change dramatically as they've changed this year, because this year it's projected at $1 million, or they might stay really flat, or even being zero if the economy is really, really bad. So the numbers projected also include a 3% increase every year in expenditures. And in this model, it's a status quo in terms of services, so it does not include expansion of services. It's just a snapshot of how the expenditures will go if we were keeping what we have and kept going. The good news is that for at least 4 to 5 years, we're not running out of money, keeping things as they are now. So it is an ideal time to think strategically on how to face those time or utilize the funding that are allocated to this program. And if you have any questions, particularly Mr. Berkeley Brennan, I'll be happy to address them.
Thank you.
To the best of my abilities.
Thank you, Marissa. Is the growth allocation for next year, this year it's 844 grand, next year we've got it at just over $1 million. And that number is what's keeping us relatively well at the moment, it would seem to me.
It's
Why is it-
projected, but it is projected by CSAC, I believe, and the CPOC, so it's kind of a more reliable number than the other ones that you'll see after.
This is money that the state is giving to us in addition to our, main, our baseline, which I guess is the main allocation.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
And so this year, we know we got 844 grand. Or is that not true?
Let me think. Because we received the growth allocation, I believe, in October. So that, I honestly don't know if it's an actual or a projected. But I would say in any case, it's quite close.
All right. Well, I guess what's interesting to me about this is, if you look at our revenues, we're running, and it went up quite a bit this year. I mean, we had a lot of increased revenues. If you look at that annual funding, no reserve line, when I say it went up this year, I mean it's expected to go up next year by quite a bit. And that's because our main allocation apparently is going up, and so is the growth allocation. But as you look at this thing kind of extend out, our budget, what we're projecting, and maybe this is largely because, look at the main allocation drops down to this sort of baseline figure of 11.8, and the growth allocation is sitting there at 471, and maybe those are wrong. But if you look at this, let me just finish this thought, and then you tell me what you think about that. Our budget, our revenues, we're projecting around 12 million. And when you look at our expenditures on the second to last line, when you add that 3%, it just keeps going up. And so, as you show on here, we end up essentially running out of money in 1920. Is this realistic? I mean, do we really think that those are going to be the numbers in 17, 18? And how do we plug in the numbers that we did plug in? And I'm referring to our revenues, because we know expenditures are going to go up, but it's these revenue numbers that end up dropping off that ends up really creating a large gap. It ends up being, about a $2 million gap over our revenues in 1920. And I'm just wondering how much stock we should put in these revenue projections we've got here.
Okay, this is a fiscal perspective of this budget, and fiscal people are very conservative, and they only count their chickens when they have them. So what that means is there is a trend of leveling on the annual allocation, so probably those numbers are not that off. The growth allocation is a question mark because it really depends on how much revenue, in addition to the base allocation, the state is collecting. So if you believe that the economy will continue kind of at the same level as now, then those are severely underestimated. But it could even become zero if the economy goes down. So from a fiscal perspective, it's not prudent to emphasize no number because we don't know. But they might change significantly. And that's why each year this document changes, and each year the numbers are more precise up to that point. So, so we don't know. So
Okay,
our
so
fiscal person only feels comfortable about putting the minimum in those.
I understand you don't want to get pinned down, and I don't blame you.
No, but
Are you suggesting that is probation suggesting that really to be well here, for us to I don't want to use the term prudent and efficient and effective, that really the only thing we need to do is establish a reserve account, and that's really the thing that we need to do right now. We don't need to worry too much about the budget going forward because we don't know what the revenues are, and if we had a a reserve amount that was a specific percentage relative to the previous year, we'd be well. Is that what you're recommending? Is that why you don't have anything in your recommendations about, cuts or anything like that?
No, I think it's not appropriate to talk about cuts at this point whatsoever. But what is appropriate, typically in the county business cycle, we're kind of tied up to yearly budgets. This document is one of the tools that allow you to think more globally than just 1 year and say, okay, in 3 years, things are going to be probably at this level, and in 5 at this level, and in 10 at this level. How do we want to manage these changes strategically? Because we have the time at this point to establish priorities, to establish a reserve, to monitor how it goes, to change it maybe in 2 years because things are better or worse. So it's kind of a dynamic, but it would be a pity not to take the opportunity to think strategically about how this process is going to be managed. But no, we're not suggesting cuts to programs.
So just one request maybe for next time as we put this together, and if Dawn could, maybe above the annual expenditures line for each year, put the annual budget. Because expenditures are different than budget. And I even think when we get to the budget workshop, kind of understanding, I don't think it has to be by every contract, right? Because you can get into so much minutia that it doesn't matter. But maybe by category, where is the underspending occurring? And that's just a valuable point of information. And that difference between annual expenditures and annual budget is a valuable point so that we know, again, if you're trying to prioritize reductions, should we get that to that point, or prioritize where we want to invest? Knowing that parameter of where we're locking up money, which may not be used, is a valuable point of reference.
I have a question. Help me understand you on the reserve line. This is what you project to hold it, and I'm looking at 16-17. This is what you project to hold in our reserves for 4792 or 93.
No, okay, the 13 million, is that what you're looking at, 13?
I'm looking at your reserve line.
He's
and I'm
looking at the year-end
projected-
reserve.
Okay, so the year-end reserve is a byproduct of the difference between what was budgeted, what was spent, and what was in the reserve to start with. So if the budget is a certain amount, but what's spent is less, then the reserve is going to go up in amount. If it's more, and it's typically eroded a bit every year because the budget is bigger than the allocation, then the reserve is, and the expenditures are consistent with that budget, then the reserve is going to go down. So the reserve, we don't have an actual number for the reserve of fiscal year 15-16 because the year has not been closed. But when it does get closed in September, then the reserve can change a little bit, and so forth every year.
So our reserve policy is not part of this fact. This not part of this equation. When we adopt one.
It would be if there was a reserve policy. Okay. So in other entities, they've determined that because they have to keep, let's say, 5%, they're going to have to extrapolate that amount from what's allocated, let's say. And if what is allocated is not completely spent, the reserve can go up. So next year, they might say, okay, we want to keep the 5%, so we have a little more money to spend because we didn't spend it last year. It's really a dynamic process, and the year after is influenced on what happened the year before.
More or less, what is the percentage right here of the reserve in comparison to the actual budget?
Let's see.
25%.
It's projected at 4,000,007 over 12.
It's about 25%.
25%?
Yeah.
Roughly.
So obviously, that's substantially high. So, and going back to our earlier discussion about the range, 5 to 15%, quite frankly, I think 15% is too high, considering the limited amount of money we have for programming in the first place. So when we get to the discussion around a reserve policy, I think we should be looking at a lower range such as 5%, maybe up to 10, but I'd even doubt that because it's a substantial amount of money that we're holding in reserve. And if we continue to do that, yeah, we're going to be in the negative, but we really don't need to be.
Thank you. Any further comments? I'll take public comment on this item. Seeing none. We've completed our scheduled agenda. I was remiss earlier. I want to welcome interim public defender Frank Dice to the Community Corrections Partnership. Thank you, Frank. As many of you know, Frank has done defense work in this county for more years than he would care to mention, I think, and was our public defender at one time. So we appreciate having you aboard, Frank. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I've really been impressed with the probation office and the figures and the way you've organized this. I would have had a couple of things to say, but I really wasn't prepared for as detailed and everything has been done here, and I appreciate the introduction. Thank you.
And our new county council representative to the Community Corrections Board is Cynthia Hassan. Thank you for being here, Cynthia. And we are adjourned. Thank you very much.